I know that some of you guys like the easier painting tutorials, so that's what we're going to be doing today. It's a very simple sketch of a German Shepherd using an airbrush with one color and an eraser. I normally like to paint or draw these sketches on hot press paper, and I do them to relax, take it easy, maybe get away from the world just for a little bit, and I work pretty quickly on these because I just paint them for myself. But I'm going to be using a clayboard here because it's easier for me to film a video like this, especially when I speed it up. But hot press paper is still my favorite surface, and if you want it to erase better, all you need to do is apply a coat or two of gesso. Here's my completed sketch if you want to follow along, and the first thing I did was draw out all of my lines with the 2H graphite pencil, nice and light so that none of these graphite lines are going to show through for the final painting. I'll put that completed painting on the left side of the screen, and like always, the first thing I'm going to do is start by painting in the eye. Now, the paint that I'm using here is Schmincke Aero colors. I have it reduced about 20% with distilled water. The first thing I'm going to do is work in the center of the eye, so I'm going to start painting in the lower part of the pupil, and I'm spraying a fair amount of paint here to get a darker value painted in. You'll see for the majority of this painting that I'll be using my airbrush mostly freehand without any sort of shields, masks, or stencils. It's only a sketch here. I don't need my lines to be razor sharp. And if some of those transitions are a bit softer in some areas, maybe a bit messy, that's just fine for me when I'm sketching. I'll move along to this upper eyelid, which is a pretty dark value that surrounds the upper contour of the eye. So you'll see that I'll just paint it in with this paint, going slowly, making sure to work from one side of it to the next. I'll connect the edges of the pupil and the iris to that upper eyelid, but I want to make sure I leave a gap in the center where that specular highlight's going to be. And then I'll continue with this paint along the lower eyelid. It's a bit wider on the left side, so you can see I just paint in the edges, fill in the center, and then the right side where it gets thinner, I move the airbrush a little bit. I'm sorry about that. I had to stop the audio there because my dog started barking. I think it's a good time to show him on video. This is my dog Stash. He's not as tough as a German Shepherd. He's just a miniature pinscher, but he thinks he's as tough. So I just took him on a walk so that he calms down. We don't have any more interruptions. He also got fat shamed at the vet last visit, so more walks is always a good thing. Going back to this painting, you'll see that I'm holding the front of the airbrush very close to the panel that I'm painting. I'm spraying air the entire time, and I'm just slightly rocking the trigger backward and forward. On the left side here, where this dark value of the tear duct is going to be, you'll see that I paint the edges in first. I just kind of make an outline, and then I fill in the center with the airbrush. I'll just back it up a little bit to fill in a wider spray pattern. And as I extend this on that upper eyelid, I'm doing the same thing. I'm just holding the airbrush a little bit farther back so the spray pattern is a bit wider. I get a softer gradient along the edges. For the right side of this lower eyelid, there's a thinner line here, so the key to that is proximity, the airbrush being closer to the surface. I spray air, then I start moving the airbrush. While I'm moving it, I rock the trigger back a little bit to start spraying paint, and I continue spraying this line, following my pencil line underneath. Now, like I mentioned, the majority of this I'm painting it in freehand, so one way that I can help sharpen up the lines is using an eraser like I'm doing here. Just come into these highlights, remove some paint, just remove some overspray, and sharpens up the edges. I'll add a bit more of this paint into the pupil and the iris. You can see I'm extending the iris out here along the bottom, softening up the edges, and then using that eraser again to help clean up some overspray. For the shadow below the eye, you'll see that I'm following my pencil lines and I'm just blocking it in. A light amount of paint first, get everything in place, and then I can spray a little bit more to help darken it. For a bit of texture within this dark value, I could spray in some thin irregular lines, almost like squiggles, so that the edge along the top here is not too smooth. Above the eye, you can see in my completed painting, there's a darker shadow up here, so I'm just blocking that in with a light value of paint, and then along the left side where we have this other darker value, I'll start by painting in the bottom, and then I'm just going to paint in a bunch of lines parallel to one another, being a little bit messy with it, kind of letting some of them overlap. This is very similar to hatching and drawing. And this sort of simple texture that I'm painting in here is going to help the final painting look a lot more like a graphite or a charcoal sketch, which is what I'm going for. When I'm sketching like this, I'm always thinking to myself about the values of light and dark and the midtones in between, so I'm not actually painting the hair or fur, just painting the impression of it. I'll add some paint over the top of this. You're going to see that helps darken up the value, and then for this next shadow down in the lower left, I'll just paint in the outline of it. Once that's done, I'll sketch in the direction that the hair is flowing, and then glaze some paint over the top to darken the value. A bit more on the left, a bit less on the right, that way we get a gradient in there. Now for some of these highlights, I'm going to switch over to an eraser. I'm using a soft one here, and you'll see that I'm just working along that transition between the shadow that I just painted in and the corresponding highlight. I'll pull out some thin curved lines here parallel to one another. It's going to brighten up the area, but it's also going to give the impression of hair or fur. And within a few of these shadows, I can sketch or hatch in some lines here to break up that overly soft look. I'll add in this wider shadow above the eye to block in the placement of it, and then I'll sketch in a few lines perpendicular to that wider one that I just painted in, following the direction or the flow of the hair. I'll then spray in a very light glaze of this black paint along the base of it to help darken it up, add a bit of a gradient, a transition from dark up to light. As I'm looking at my photo reference of this German Shepherd, I'm trying to pay attention to where I see the next dark value, and I'm noticing this one just below the eye. So I'm going to use that same technique of hatching in some loose lines to follow the curve of this shadow. And you'll notice here that they're not too dark. I didn't spray that much paint. I kept it on the lighter side, and then I'll use my eraser to sketch in some lines in between. I'll glaze a very light amount of this black paint into this highlight above the shadow that we just painted, and that's going to give me something to erase into, so I can use my eraser here to sketch out a few lines, give the impression of hair or fur. Moving along to the lower part of the forehead, between the two eyes, there's a darker shadow within the center here, so I'm just going to sketch in a line, just like I showed before, a few hatching lines across, and then fill in some paint to the left and the right of it. I'll continue that shadow up the forehead using a shield to help me get a sharper line in there, and then I'm going to start filling in the darker values for the left eye. I'm following my graphite lines, and I'm starting with the outer contours, just painting in that edge, that transition between the shadow and the light, and I'll continue it up to where the eyebrow is. And I'll make sure to leave a little gap within the center because the eye is reflecting some light, so we need a highlight in there. I'll lightly spray in a few of these surrounding shadows, and then for the highlights and the overspray, I'll go back to my eraser to remove some paint. For the edge of the forehead on the left side, I'm just going to draw in a squiggly line here. For the snout or the muzzle of this German Shepherd, the first thing I'm noticing is this darker shadow within the center of it that moves right up from the nose over to the eye. So I sketched in a few lines following the flow of the hair, just to give the impression of fur, and then I'm using a piece of paper as a freehand shield to mask off the top part of the painting and spray some paint down. Just like how I painted in the dark values surrounding the eye, for the snout here, I'm paying attention to my reference photo and squinting my eyes and just trying to notice where I see these darker values. The graphite lines drawn on my panel are guiding me as well, so I just sketch in a few short dashes or lines anywhere that I'm seeing these values, and I'll do the best I can to follow the flow of the hair, but for a quick sketch like this, it really doesn't matter too much to me. What's most important is the values and the placement of them. I'll use that eraser in a few of these areas to remove a little bit of paint just to pull out some light, and then what I want to do is sharpen up this transition between the forehead and the eye. So you'll see that I lined up a ripped piece of paper, spray some paint to the left that gives me a sharper edge, and then I'll also use this piece of paper to work down the left side of the snout. This way, as I work my way down to the nose, I'm blocking off the background so that paint doesn't get on there. Then I'll paint in a few jagged lines along that transition just so that edge is not too sharp, make it look a little bit more natural. Now I'll come around quickly with my eraser, and just like I did before for the darker values, I'm squinting my eyes and looking for the lighter values. Anywhere I see them, I'll draw in a few lines to indicate that there's some light in these areas. And if you look at my completed sketch on the left side of the screen, you'll notice that there's a very dark value, almost pure black, just to the right of the nose. I mapped it in with a light amount of this black paint first, and the way I did that is just by spraying less paint, and I'm well aware this is going to need to be much darker later on, but I'm adding the placement of this value in now to help me understand where the right side of the nose is going to end. For the nose, I'm just going to paint this in freehand. I'm starting on the left side where the left nostril is, and then working my way up along the contour of the nose toward the background. You'll see that I just painted a thin line all the way up along that contour, and then I'll start filling in the right nostril. And again, I'm following my pencil lines. Like always, even for a sketch like this, I'm thinking about placement and proportion first. So once I get the major parts of the nose in place, like both nostrils and the columella in between them, I can switch over to a paint directly from the bottle, start adding some more value in here to darken everything up, set it in place. There's a few areas of highlight in here, so I'll use my soft eraser again to draw them in. Just a few thin lines in between the nostrils. I'll add in a few of the darker values that extend over to the right, and also add some of this paint just above the nostrils so we get that front part of the nose kind of rounding away from the light source. And then I'll slowly build up the values of paint and use a soft eraser within the highlight on the nose to remove some paint. I'll also sketch in a few dashes with my eraser along the outer contour of the nose to give the impression that there's some light hitting that area. Now moving along to the mouth, I'm noticing a darker line right underneath the nose, so you'll see that I'm painting that in, pulling back a little bit farther on the trigger to paint in a darker line, and then a bit of paint along the left side between the transition of the mouth and the background. There's also this darker soft value down the center of the nose, so I'll paint that in, holding the airbrush a little bit farther back from the surface so I get a wider spray pattern, pull a little bit farther back on the trigger to spray more paint. I'll paint in this thin line here to designate where this darker shadow is going to start, then I'll use my eraser to remove some more paint from that thin highlight in between the nostrils. And then I'm just going to spray a few layers of paint into this area, going up to that line that I painted in before, just to add a dark value of paint in here. It's going to give the impression of a shadow. When I spray freehand like this without masking off parts of the painting, overspray is going to get into areas that I don't want, so you'll constantly see me going back to some areas with my eraser to remove that overspray, just to brighten them up again. Like for example, you'll see that there's a fair amount of overspray within this background, so I'll use my eraser to remove it around the nose and the mouth, and it kind of gives a little bit of a halo effect because I didn't remove all the paint. On a regular painting, I wouldn't leave it like that, but for a sketch like this, I think it looks pretty cool, so I'm going to leave it. I'll add some paint into the right side of the nose just to cover up some of the blank panel here. And then I'll use an aggressive eraser cut to a chiseled edge. I'll come around and pull out some really bright highlights in some areas that I need them. For the chin, I'll paint in a few lines to designate the shadow down here and the edge right before the background. And then I'll spray less paint above it where this highlight on the mouth is going to be. I'll use an X-Acto blade to sketch in the placement of a few of the whiskers in here, and then I'm going to use this black paint to start adding in the dark value as I move my way to the right along to the cheek. There's a bit of a pattern within this area of some darker and some lighter bands, so you'll see that I'm using my airbrush freehand here to lightly paint in some of the darker bands first. These are just a few shadows within this part of the painting, so I get them in lightly and I start filling in the surrounding area with a few light glazes of paint. And before I go any darker to the final value within this area, this is a good time to use my eraser and my X-Acto blade to pull out a few of the highlights in here. I'll use my X-Acto blade to scratch out a few of those whiskers again, and then I'll use my eraser to draw in some hatching lines like I'm doing here for the impression of light within some parts of the fur. And you'll see for this highlight that I'm not even following the flow of the hair as I erase out the paint. Instead, I'm using these hatching lines to block in the placement of light using a lighter amount of pressure on that eraser so I don't remove too much paint. Everything's in place in this part of the painting right now, so I can start darkening up the values of paint. Each subsequent layer that I spray on gets darker and darker. Then once that layer of paint is down, I go right back over to the eraser to pull out some of the highlights, like a few of these in the whiskers and within the fur. Now for the hair on the forehead and to the right of the eye, I'll start with the darker values first. So again, I'm going to paint some lines parallel to one another, allowing them to be a bit messy, maybe letting them overlap here and there. And this is going to map in those dark values. And then once I get those in place, I'll apply a thin glaze of this paint over the top so it looks like we have a darker band of hair within this area. And then I'll paint in those darker values below the right ear, again following my pencil lines and always starting with these lighter values first. We'll darken it up later. And just a reminder, if you're new to this is a monochromatic painting, so it's only one color. Lighter values are just achieved by spraying less paint or erasing into that, and the darker values are achieved by spraying more paint. If I spray multiple layers at 100% of this paint, I'll eventually get to pure black, and that's what I did in a few parts of the painting, like within the nostril and the center of the pupil. Before I start painting in the ears, I'm going to make a few passes here with my eraser. Now I'm using an aggressive one here, and I'm mainly working into the highlights, sketching in a few lines to remove some paint, brighten up these areas, but I'm also scratching out some paint within the shadows too to help break up any uniformity within them. And if anything gets too light like it did in a few areas, I'll just add in some more paint with the airbrush to darken it back up. Let's move along to this ear, and the first thing that I want to do is paint in this black band along the right side. It's a bit wider, so I'm holding the airbrush a bit farther back from the surface. Now there's a thinner line along the outside edge to the right of that, so you'll see that I'm holding the airbrush much closer to the surface to paint this in. That's going to give me a thinner line. I'll add in a few of these hatching lines along the bottom and then inside the ear where I'm seeing some of these darker shadows. And I'll start painting in the edge along the left side. It's a thinner line, so the airbrush again is closer to the surface. And to give the impression of hair or fur in here, you'll see me just sketching in a few lines within the ear. Once that's done, I'm going to continue painting in that thin outline along the left side of the ear. And then to darken up the whole value within here, I'm going to use a piece of paper to mask off the background and spray some paint into the ear itself. And in real time, that was about 2 minutes of work, and you can see that we already get a pretty convincing ear. So to push it a little bit further, I'll use my eraser and work into the highlights. I started nice and light with those values, and then once I'm confident they're in the right place, I'm going to start adding more paint like I'm doing here to darken them, put them in place. And while I'm adding in these darker values, you're of course going to see me using that eraser every now and then to pull out some more highlights. Now, I'm going to speed through this right ear because it's really the exact same technique that I just went over. You'll see that I'm working first with a few of the outline values, just getting everything in place. And then I'll pay attention to where I'm seeing some of the darker values within the ear, block them in by spraying in a larger value of paint or using that hatching technique by painting in a bunch of thin lines. And then, of course, switching over to the eraser to clean up some overspray, add in the highlights. So same technique over and over again. So you probably noticed that I'm not painting in any individual hairs or fur in this one. All I'm doing is filling in values of light and dark using a hatching motion with my airbrush and my eraser. As long as I block in those values within the correct placements and proportions, even if I paint loosely like I'm doing in this one, the final painting of this German Shepherd is going to look like it has hair on it, especially if you look at it a bit farther away. And these are really fun to work on, especially if you just paint them for yourself. This one probably took me about 3 20 to 30 minute sessions, so about an hour of work from start to finish. For me personally, it's always just been one of my favorite ways to relax more than anything else. It also allows me to loosen up in my paintings or drawings and just focus on the bare essentials like value and proportion. So that's where I'm going to wrap this one up. Thank you guys so much for being here and for watching. Make sure you try this one out for yourself. It's a lot easier to do than you might think. So here's my completed painting up on the screen now and some brighter lights. And I want to say thank you so much to the very generous support of the current channel members scrolling up on the screen right now. I'd also like to welcome the newest channel member this week. That's Shamir. Thank you so much and welcome to the channel. I hope all of you have a great weekend, a great week. All the best to you in your paintings, and I'll see you back here next Friday.